The Storm and the Choice. The storm rolled across the city like an angry beast unleashed from the heavens. Dark, swollen clouds churned against each other, spilling torrents of icy rain that slapped the asphalt with relentless fury. The streets glistened under the watery assault, streams rushing along the curbs, carrying with them leaves, scraps of paper, and the forgotten remnants of the day. The air smelled of ozone and mud, a heavy metallic tang that filled the lungs and promised no mercy. Lightning cracked across the horizon, a jagged claw of white light ripping the sky apart for a fleeting heartbeat before the thunder roared so violently that windows rattled and even the bravest heart skipped a beat. And in the middle of that chaos, a weathered red pickup truck struggled forward, its wipers screeching in protest as they fought a losing battle against the sheets of rain. Inside that truck sat Noah Evans, his hands gripping the wheel with a steady firmness that came less from calmness and more from years of survival. He was 36 years old, a man who carried the etched lines of responsibility on his face, lines carved by sleepless nights, overdue bills, and the constant weight of being both father and mother to his 8-year-old son. His short black hair was plastered to his forehead, beads of water running down the side of his face where the roof had started leaking again, but he ignored it, just as he had learned to ignore so many of life's unfairness. His eyes, however, dark, steady, and sharp, remained fixed on the clock glowing faintly on the dashboard. 8:50 a.m., 10 minutes left, 10 minutes before the interview that could change everything, the one at Dalton Tech he had waited months for. He had rehearsed answers late into the night, ironed his only good shirt twice, and promised his son that when he returned home that evening, things would be different. They would not have to stretch beans and rice across 3 meals. They would not have to choose between heating the apartment and buying shoes that fit. Tonight, he had whispered to Ben, would be the first step toward a better life. But life, Noah knew, had a cruel sense of humor. Because just as he pressed his boot harder against the pedal, urging the aging truck forward through the curtain of rain, he saw movement across the flooded intersection that pulled him into an impossible choice. There, barely visible through the mist and water, a sleek black sedan sat at an awkward angle, one wheel swallowed deep into the mud that had formed where construction had left the road unfinished. Its door flung open suddenly, and a figure stumbled out. A woman, young, in a tailored gray coat that clung to her body under the storm's assault. Her heels sank instantly into the sludge, and with each desperate tug she only buried herself deeper. He saw her hair, dark brown now plastered against her face, her hands clawing at the door for balance, her expression one of panic mingled with fury. The storm had reduced her composure to a fragile mask, streaks of mascara running down her cheeks like ink bleeding across paper. For a moment Noah's foot pressed harder on the gas, his instincts screaming at him to keep going. The interview was everything. He had already sacrificed sleep, pride, and months of planning for this one chance. He thought of Ben's eager little face that morning, the boy's brown eyes bright with the fragile hope of a child who trusted his father to move mountains. "You'll get it, Dad," Ben had said, clutching the worn backpack he never complained about even when the zipper broke. "You always do what you say." The words cut now like a blade in Noah's chest. If he stopped for this stranger, he would not make it on time. And Dalton Tech wasn't known for second chances. But even as he tried to push forward, his hands betrayed him. His grip tightened, his jaw clenched, and a familiar weight settled in his chest. He was a Marine once, and one vow had been drilled into his bones: never abandon someone in need. He had carried brothers on his back through enemy fire, shielded strangers in distant deserts, and promised himself he would never become the kind of man who turned away because it was convenient. The rain hammered harder, drumming against the windshield in wild rhythm, as if urging him to decide. His heart pounded, each beat echoing louder than the thunder. 10 minutes. 9 now, maybe less. He could still make it if he ignored her, but then her cry split the storm, raw and desperate, as her foot twisted painfully in the sucking mud. And with that sound, Noah knew his decision was already made. "Damn it," he muttered, slamming the heel of his hand against the steering wheel in frustration. The choice would cost him everything he had prepared for, but he couldn't ignore her. He pulled the truck sharply to the side, its tires splashing into the rising flood, and threw open the door. The rain hit him like icy knives, soaking his shirt in seconds, but he pressed on, booze, tears squelching through the water as he moved toward her. She spun at the sound of footsteps, her wide eyes landing on him, and for a heartbeat he saw suspicion flash across her face. A stranger in faded jeans and a jacket patched more times than he cared to admit. To her, he looked like someone who had nothing to lose. She straightened, lifting her chin despite her helplessness, and snapped in a trembling voice, "I don't need help." Her words were sharp, but they carried the brittle edge of fear. Noah stopped just long enough to let her see the steadiness in his eyes, the calmness in his expression. "You'll sprain your ankle if you keep pulling like that," he said evenly, his voice cutting through the roar of rain with the authority of someone who had seen panic before and knew how to steady it. She faltered, tugged again, and only sank deeper. At last, with no options left, she gave the smallest nod. Noah crouched, ignoring the mud that seeped into his jeans, and wrapped his strong, calloused hands around her trapped heel. With one decisive pull, he freed her foot, steadying her as she stumbled back to the safety of the car door. Before she could even muster words, he turned, jogging back to his truck. From the bed, he hauled out an old tow chain, its metal slick with rain but still strong from years of service. In practiced motion, he hooked it to the sedan's bumper and secured the other end to his truck. "Get inside," he called firmly, and she obeyed without further argument, sliding back into the sedan with the grace of someone unaccustomed to taking orders but smart enough to recognize competence when she saw it. The truck roared, wheels spinning against the slick road before gripping hard. Noah gritted his teeth, muscles taut as he coaxed the pickup forward, chains straining, mud spraying violently. Then, with a final wrenching groan, the sedan jerked free, rolling back onto the solid pavement. The chain rattled loose, and the job was done. Noah climbed down, unhooked it quickly, and turned away without waiting for thanks. Every second wasted was another nail in the coffin of his interview. He strode back toward his truck, his mind already heavy with the realization that time had betrayed him. "Wait!" Her voice cut through the storm, commanding in tone but tinged with surprise. The window rolled down and she leaned out, holding a bill between delicate fingers. Her face was sharp now, cold despite the storm's chaos, as though she had rebuilt her mask in record time. "At least take this." The rain plastered his hair against his forehead, water running down his temples as he shook his head firmly. "No need. I'm already late for my interview." He was about to close the door when her voice halted him again. "Interview? Where?" Her question carried a strange urgency, as though she couldn't quite believe what she heard. "Dalton Tech," he answered simply, his tone flat with resignation, and then he climbed into the truck, started the engine, and pulled away. As the pickup rumbled down the flooded street, Noah's heart sank. He glanced at the clock. Past 9 now. Too late. The months of preparation, the sacrifices, the hope he had promised his son, all gone in the blink of a storm. He let out a hollow laugh, bitter and cracked. "Nice job, Noah," he muttered under his breath. Outside, the rain pounded harder, drowning out everything but the hum of the engine and the sound of dreams slipping away. He tried not to think of Ben's face when he would have to explain that once again, life had knocked them down. He tried not to think of how close he had been to changing everything. And yet, as he glanced in the rearview mirror, he saw the black sedan still standing firm on the road, its headlights cutting through the mist. Behind its window, he glimpsed the woman watching him, her expression unreadable. For a fleeting second, he wondered what she saw when she looked at him. A fool who had thrown away his one chance? Or something else entirely? He didn't know. He only knew one thing. His choice had been made. And though it cost him dearly, it was the kind of choice he could live with. He pressed his foot to the pedal, vanishing into the storm, unaware that his life had just begun to shift in ways he could never imagine. The stranger revealed. The storm finally began to ease by the time Noah reached the cracked driveway of his apartment complex, though the clouds still loomed heavy like bruises smeared across the sky. His pickup rattled to a stop, the engine coughing in complaint, as if it too had felt the weight of failure. He sat behind the wheel for a long moment, staring blankly at the rain streaking across the windshield, his chest rising and falling with a hollow heaviness. His shirt clung damp against his body. His hair dripped in messy strands, but the chill in his bones had nothing to do with the storm outside. He had missed it. The interview was gone. All the nights of rehearsing, all the hours spent researching Dalton Tech's projects, memorizing facts, practicing confidence in front of the mirror. It had all dissolved into nothing because he couldn't ignore a stranger's cry for help. His throat tightened as he imagined the look on Ben's face, the way his son's hopeful little smile would falter when Noah explained that the better life he had promised was still just out of reach. The stranger revealed. The storm finally began to ease by the time Noah reached the cracked driveway of his apartment complex, though the clouds still loomed heavy like bruises smeared across the sky. His pickup rattled to a stop, the engine coughing in complaint as if it too had felt the weight of failure. He sat behind the wheel for a long moment, staring blankly at the rain streaking across the windshield, his chest rising and falling with a hollow heaviness. His shirt clung damp against his body. His hair dripped in messy strands, but the chill in his bones had nothing to do with the storm outside. He had missed it. The interview was gone. All the nights of rehearsing, all the hours spent researching Dalton Tech's projects, memorizing facts, practicing confidence in front of the mirror, it had all dissolved into nothing because he couldn't ignore a stranger's cry for help. His throat tightened as he imagined the look on Ben's face, the way his son's hopeful little smile would falter when Noah explained that the better life he had promised was still just out of reach. The apartment itself was as weary as the man who called it home. The paint on the stairwell peeled in long, curling strips. The dim hallway light flickered as Noah climbed the steps, his boots squeaking with each step. He unlocked the door quietly, half expecting his son to still be asleep, but the small figure was already curled up on the couch, blanket wrapped around narrow shoulders, eyes fixed on the window as if waiting for him. "Dad," Ben said softly, his voice carrying both relief and curiosity. "Did you get it?" That simple question felt like a dagger twisting in Noah's chest. He forced a smile, kneeling beside the boy, brushing damp strands of hair from his son's forehead. "Not today, champ," he murmured. "But I tried." Ben nodded slowly, and though disappointment flickered across his young features, he didn't argue. He didn't complain. He only leaned into his father's side, trusting that somehow things would be okay. That trust both warmed and crushed Noah because he wasn't sure how many more failures he could carry before it broke them both. Later, after Ben had gone to school and the apartment had fallen silent, Noah sat at the small kitchen table with a mug of black coffee that had long gone cold. He stared at the folder of resumes and cover letters, the carefully printed notes he had prepared, and felt the sting of wasted effort. His hands curled into fists against the table. He had done everything right. He had prepared, planned, prayed. But one choice, the only choice his conscience would allow, had cost him everything. He wanted to be angry, to blame the storm, the broken road, the stranger in her expensive car. Yet deep down, he knew he couldn't. He had done what he believed was right. The bitterness that gnawed at him now came not from regret, but from the cruel reality that doing right didn't always pay the bills. While Noah wrestled with his frustration across the city in a gleaming glass tower that pierced the storm-darkened clouds, Alexandra Dalton stood before her office window, her reflection merging with the skyline. Her gray coat was gone, replaced by a tailored suit that spoke of authority and wealth. Her hair, once plastered wet against her face, now fell in a smooth cascade over her shoulders. Yet despite her polished exterior, her mind replayed the storm's memory with stubborn persistence. She had been stranded, helpless in the mud, humiliated by her own lack of control, and it was that man, strange, quiet, rough-edged, who had pulled her free. Not for money, not for recognition, but simply because it was the right thing to do. She had tested him in that moment, offering payment, expecting the usual eagerness that so often surrounded her name, but he had refused with a dignity that unsettled her. Even when she had pressed with suspicion, His answer had been steady, his gaze unwavering. "Not everyone lives only for themselves," he had said. She couldn't shake those words. Alexandra Dalton was no ordinary woman. At 32, she was the CEO of Dalton Tech, the very company where Noah had hoped to interview. Born into privilege, educated at the best schools, and hardened by the relentless scrutiny of corporate power, she had long since grown accustomed to people bending over backward for her approval. She was used to flattery disguised as loyalty, to smiles that hid agendas. But in the rain, facing a man with nothing but determination in his eyes, she had seen something she rarely encountered: sincerity. It bothered her more than she cared to admit. Why would a man who clearly needed every opportunity throw away his chance at survival for a stranger? Why would someone like him risk his future when most in her world calculated every move for advantage? These questions clung to her, refusing to be dismissed. That afternoon, in the boardroom polished to perfection, Alexandra sat through a series of presentations that blurred together into the same predictable pitches she had heard countless times. Numbers, charts, projections, all sterile, all lacking the pulse of conviction she craved. Her thoughts drifted back to the storm, to the stranger's steady voice and the refusal in his eyes. "I didn't do it for money." His words rang louder than the suits around her. When the meeting finally ended, she returned to her office and instructed her assistant to dig into a name she had caught in passing: Noah Evans. Dalton Tech kept records of interview candidates, and she wanted to know why that name stood out like a whisper she couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, Noah pushed forward through the week with the weight of failure pressing harder each day. He took on odd jobs, repairing fences for a neighbor, hauling boxes at a warehouse when shifts were available, but none of it stretched far enough to cover the growing bills. At night, after Ben had gone to bed, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the overdue notices that arrived with ruthless consistency. He told himself he would keep trying, that another chance would come, but deep down he felt the door closing. Dalton Tech had been his one real shot, and it was gone. Yet even in his lowest moments, he never allowed his son to see his despair. For Ben, he wore the mask of resilience, the quiet strength of a father who never gave up, even when the world seemed determined to break him. 3 days after the storm, Noah's phone rang while he was patching a leaky pipe for an elderly neighbor. The number was unfamiliar, the voice on the other end professional yet oddly deliberate. "Mr. Evans, we would like you to come to Dalton Tech headquarters tomorrow morning. A special appointment has been arranged." His heart lurched, confusion tangled with hope, but he forced his tone to remain steady. "There must be a mistake," he said. "I missed my interview." But the caller insisted, repeating the time and address before ending the call. Noah stood in the dim kitchen of the neighbor's apartment, water dripping into a rusted bucket, and felt the ground shift beneath him. Something about the invitation felt strange, but he couldn't deny the sliver of possibility it carried. That night, he tucked Ben into bed with an extra story, his voice calm, but his mind restless, replaying the storm, the stranger, the words he had spoken without knowing they had been heard by someone far more powerful than he realized. And in her high-rise office, Alexandra Dalton reviewed the file her assistant had placed on her desk. A single father, former Marine, odd jobs to survive, no criminal record, no connections, nothing to explain the strength she had seen in his eyes except a life lived through struggle. She closed the file slowly, her fingers tracing the edges as if weighing more than just paper. She had built her empire on sharp instincts, on recognizing potential hidden where others saw none. And in the storm, she had recognized something rare, a man who would not bend, even when the world gave him every reason to. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze once more fixed on the skyline. Tomorrow, she would meet Noah Evans again, not as a stranded woman in the rain, but as the CEO who held the power to change his life forever. The invitation. The morning sun was pale and uncertain, hidden behind streaks of gray clouds, when Noah Evans stood in front of the towering glass facade of Dalton Tech. The building stretched upward like a monument to ambition, gleaming panels of steel and glass reflecting the city in fractured pieces, as though the very structure had been designed to remind anyone who approached it of their own smallness. He tightened his grip on the strap of his worn messenger bag, his palm slightly damp with nerves, though not the same kind of nerves he had felt days before when he had hoped for an interview. This was different. This was strange. He hadn't applied again, hadn't begged for another chance, and yet here he was, summoned by a voice on the phone that had spoken with such authority that he hadn't dared question it too deeply. Inside the lobby, everything gleamed with polished perfection. Marble floors stretched wide beneath chandeliers that spilled golden light over the space. Reception desks gleamed with steel trim, staffed by people in tailored suits whose eyes lingered on him just long enough to measure and dismiss him. Noah felt the weight of his faded jacket, the scuff on his shoes, the frayed strap of his bag. He knew how he looked among people who seemed to glide effortlessly through this place, as if they had been born to it. He walked forward anyway, shoulders squared, his Marine training whispering in the back of his mind that confidence wasn't in clothing. It was in posture, in resolve. "Mr. Evans?" The receptionist's voice carried a hint of polite surprise when he gave his name. She tapped at her screen, her brow furrowing briefly, and then her eyes flicked up with a newfound respect she tried to mask. "Please, this way." She gestured toward a set of private elevators, not the general ones used by staff and visitors. Noah's chest tightened with suspicion. He followed, each step echoing against the marble, and when the elevator doors closed around him, he was left alone with the sound of his own heartbeat steady but faster than usual. The ride felt endless, the numbers climbing higher and higher until the elevator finally opened onto a floor hushed with the kind of luxury that came only with power. Plush carpets, art on the walls, and panoramic windows that stretched the skyline into a breathtaking sweep. An assistant waited there, crisp and precise, and without a word led him down a hallway toward double doors carved from dark wood. The assistant pushed them open with deliberate care. Noah stepped inside. The office was expansive, lined with shelves of books and awards, a desk large enough to command attention but not cluttered. Behind it stood the woman from the storm. Gone was the rain-soaked stranger who had flailed helplessly in the mud. Here stood Alexandra Dalton, flawless, commanding, and sharp as a blade. Her suit was tailored perfectly, her posture straight, her expression composed into an unreadable mask. She studied him for a moment, and the silence stretched long enough that he felt the full shift of power between them. "You made it," she said finally, her voice cool and steady, though her eyes flickered with something more complicated. Noah inclined his head slightly. "I was told to come. I didn't want to waste your time." Her lips curved, though it wasn't quite a smile. "You didn't waste my time in the storm either. You wasted your own." She gestured toward a chair across from her desk. "Sit." He obeyed, lowering himself slowly into the seat, his body tense but his gaze steady on hers. For a few seconds neither spoke. The quiet hum of the city below filled the room like distant static. Finally, Alexandra leaned forward, resting her hands lightly on the desk. "You don't recognize me, do you?" she asked. Noah frowned slightly. "Should I?" "I'm Alexandra Dalton," she said simply, her tone carrying no boast, only fact. "CEO of Dalton Tech." The name hit him like a strike to the chest. His eyes flickered, and for a moment he looked down, not at her, but at the gleaming floor beneath his boots. This was the woman he had missed his interview for, the stranger who had cost him everything. Except, no. She hadn't cost him. He had made that choice. And now here she was, her eyes on him, her words deliberate, her presence radiating the kind of power that could either crush him or lift him higher than he had ever stood. Noah took a breath, steadying his voice. "I guess that makes sense now. The car, the way you looked at me. You weren't just anyone. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Does that change how you see what happened? No, he said, his tone firm. I helped because you needed help. Who you are doesn't matter. For the first time, Alexandra's mask faltered. It wasn't a smile, not really, but the faintest hint of something softer flickered across her face before it vanished. She leaned back, studying him as if he were a puzzle. Most people would have taken the money, she said. Most people would have asked for something in return. You did neither. Instead, you lost the one chance you had at a future here. Noah's jaw tightened. I've lost more before. I'll survive. That answer seemed to strike her in a way she hadn't expected. She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing again, though this time with curiosity rather than suspicion. Survival. That's all it is for you, isn't it? He didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Mr. Evans, she continued after a pause, her voice sharpening, Dalton Tech doesn't hand out jobs as charity. If you're here because you think pity will open doors, you're mistaken. Noah straightened in his chair, his gaze steady, unwavering. I didn't come here asking for anything. You called me. The silence stretched again. Alexandra tapped her fingers lightly on the desk, her eyes never leaving his. Finally, she stood, walking slowly toward the window, her heels clicking softly against the floor. She stared out at the city below, her reflection sharp in the glass. I called you because I saw something I don't see often anymore. Integrity. The kind of integrity this company was built on, but has long since buried under numbers and greed. She turned back, her eyes meeting his with sudden intensity. I don't know if you're the man Dalton Tech needs, but I want to find out. Noah blinked, his chest tightening with confusion and wariness. What are you saying? I'm offering you a chance, Alexandra said, her voice steady now, her words deliberate. Not the position you interviewed for, you missed that, but something more dangerous, more important, a test. You'll work under me directly. No guarantees, no promises. You'll either prove yourself or you won't, and if you fail, you'll walk away with nothing but wasted time. Her words hit him like a gust of cold wind, stripping away all pretense. This wasn't charity. This wasn't kindness. This was a challenge. He could see it in her eyes, the way she looked at him not as a man to be pitied, but as a man to be measured. He felt the old Marine instinct stir inside him, the one that thrived under pressure, that met challenges head-on even when the odds were stacked high. He exhaled slowly. You're asking me to gamble what little I have left. I'm asking you, she countered sharply, to show me if what I saw in the storm was real or just a moment's luck. The silence that followed was thick, the air heavy with unspoken stakes. Noah sat back, his heart steadying, his resolve hardening. He didn't know if this was fate, punishment, or the beginning of something he couldn't yet name. But he knew one thing. He would know. I'd walk away. Not now. Finally, he nodded once. All right, I'll take your test. And with that, the path forward shifted again, the storm outside replaced by a storm within, one that would test every part of who he was. The test of character. The following Monday, Noah walked through the wide glass doors of Dalton Tech, not as a candidate with a polished resume, but as something far less defined and far more uncertain, a man on trial. The lobby gleamed with the same polished perfection as before, the marble floors reflecting light from the massive glass walls that stretched upward like a cathedral to ambition. He had dressed in his best again, though best was a generous word. His shirt was clean but frayed at the cuffs, his tie second-hand, his shoes polished as much as cracked leather could shine. He carried himself with quiet confidence, the kind forged in places where uniforms mattered less than courage. And though he felt the weight of every glance from the sharply dressed employees who passed by, he kept his shoulders squared, his steps firm, his gaze forward. Alexandra Dalton had not given him a position. She had given him a challenge, and with it a single condition. He would shadow her for 6 weeks, embedded in projects far above his pay grade, thrown into the harsh scrutiny of executives who would look for every reason to dismiss him. She had not sugarcoated it. "Most of them will think you don't belong here," she had said with a cool precision that allowed no illusions. "They'll be right, unless you prove otherwise." Those words haunted him as he stepped into the elevator, riding it upward toward the floor where decisions worth millions were made, where people with pedigrees and networks carved out futures as if they were entitled to them. The first test came swiftly. Within hours, Noah found himself seated in a boardroom surrounded by executives in suits so sharp they looked like armor. The air was scented faintly with cologne and fresh paper, and the table gleamed with the polish of wealth. Charts and graphs flickered across the wall as a team presented quarterly projections, their words flowing with the practiced ease of people who spoke in profits and percentages. Noah sat quietly at the edge, an observer, but he could feel the eyes of several men and women sliding toward him, measuring him like an intruder. One finally leaned forward, his voice carrying just enough bite to draw blood. "And who exactly are you?" the man asked, his polished cufflinks catching the light as he gestured toward Noah. "I don't recall approving a new consultant." Noah met his gaze calmly, his voice steady. "I'm here at Ms. Dalton's request." The man raised an eyebrow, smirking faintly as though he had just confirmed his suspicions. Of course, another one of her experiments. The chuckles that rippled around the table were quiet but deliberate. Alexandra, seated at the head of the table, did not smile. Her gaze flicked to Noah, sharp and unreadable, before returning to the presentation. She neither defended him nor explained further, leaving him to absorb the weight of the room on his own. By the end of the meeting, Noah felt like he had sat through an interrogation disguised as business. Yet he did not falter. He had listened closely, absorbing every word, every number, every nuance. Marine training had taught him that survival wasn't always about fighting. It was about observing, learning the terrain, adapting faster than those who thought they already understood it. He left the room with a mind buzzing, already piecing together flaws in the arguments he had heard, cracks in the projections that no one else seemed to question. The next day brought another challenge. Alexandra sent him to the production floor, a vast space where machines whirred and workers moved with mechanical efficiency. Here, the suits were replaced by uniforms, and the suspicion was different but no less sharp. Foremen eyed him like an outsider sent to spy. Workers muttered under their breath, and even the hum of machinery seemed to carry the question, who is this man, and why is he here? Yet Noah did what he had always done best. He rolled up his sleeves, stepped into the grime, and worked alongside them. He asked questions, not to impress, but to understand. He lifted crates when others struggled, tightened bolts when machines jammed, and spoke to the workers with the respect of someone who knew what it meant to labor until your bones ached. By the end of the week, whispers had begun to shift. "He's different," some said, "not like the others." Still, not everyone was convinced. The executives mocked him quietly in glass offices, convinced he was a charity project, a temporary experiment to satisfy their CEO's whims. "Dalton's stray," one of them called him within earshot, a title meant to sting. And though Noah felt the burn of humiliation, he did not react. His pride was not so fragile that it needed defending against men who measured worth in wealth alone. Instead, he focused on what he could control, showing up, working hard, refusing to bend to either scorn or pity. What surprised him most, however, was Alexandra herself. She watched him with the precision of a hawk, her sharp eyes missing nothing. At times she seemed cold, deliberately distant, allowing the hostility around him to press harder rather than shielding him from it. At other times, he caught her gaze lingering longer than expected, as though she were studying not just his performance, but the core of who he was. On one late evening when the office had emptied and only the glow of city lights spilled through the windows, she approached him as he reviewed a stack of reports he had volunteered to analyze. "You don't scare easily," she said, her voice low, almost thoughtful. Noah glanced up, meeting her eyes. "I've been through worse than boardrooms and cold shoulders." Her lips twitched, though whether it was the ghost of a smile or a test he couldn't tell. Most people in your position would have folded by now, quit, or begged for approval. You do neither. Why? He leaned back slightly, his voice calm. Because I'm not here to be liked. I'm here to prove to myself that I can do this. The rest doesn't matter. For a heartbeat, her mask cracked again, just slightly. She nodded once, turned, and left without another word. But Noah felt something shift that night. Not in her, not yet, but in the current between them. She had seen his answer not as bravado, but as truth. As the weeks stretched on, Noah faced test after test. Long nights pored over spreadsheets he barely understood at first, but learned to navigate through sheer persistence. Days spent on the factory floor, earning nods of respect from men who rarely trusted outsiders. Heated exchanges in meetings where he challenged assumptions with the blunt honesty of someone untrained in corporate niceties, but deeply trained in survival logic. Slowly, grudgingly, Dalton Tech began to take notice. Not because he had charm or polish, but because he had something rarer, an integrity that could not be faked, a grit that could not be bought. And Alexandra noticed most of all. She saw the man who had risked everything in a storm begin to carve space in her world of steel and glass, and though she kept her distance, watching with the cool detachment of a leader who never allowed herself to be swayed, something inside her stirred, a question she had not asked in years. What if this man, this outsider, sees something I've lost? For Noah, the weeks were grueling, each day a battle against doubt, against scorn, against the relay, endless pressure of proving himself. Yet every night when he returned to his small apartment, when Ben ran to the door with his tired but trusting smile, Noah knew why he endured. Because this wasn't just his test, it was his son's future, and he would not fail. The transformation. The storm that had once raged over cracked asphalt now returned in a different form, this time not in the sky, but inside the polished heart of Dalton Tech itself. Whispers rippled through the halls like sparks catching dry tinder. Numbers didn't add up. Contracts were failing. Investors were circling like vultures, smelling weakness in the very company that had once stood as a beacon of innovation. By the time the first official memo reached the lower floors, panic was already seeping into the building, tightening jaws and sharpening glares. Executives rushed through corridors with phones pressed to their ears, muttering words that betrayed fear. Sabotage, exposure, leak. Noah Evans stood in the center of this storm, watching the frantic current sweep around him with a soldier's composure. He had sensed it coming long before the alarm bells rang. Late nights poring over reports, inconsistencies no one wanted to see, patterns too easily dismissed as clerical errors. He had brought them up once in a meeting, only to be brushed aside by men with too much pride to admit a mechanic-minded outsider had spotted what they hadn't. But now the cracks had widened into a chasm, and Dalton Tech teetered on the edge of collapse. When Alexandra Dalton summoned her senior staff to the executive boardroom, the air inside was thick with the scent of desperation masked by expensive cologne. Graphs sprawled across digital screens, their sharp lines painting pictures of impending disaster. Voices overlapped, harsh and urgent, some demanding immediate cuts, others whispering of resignation, still others looking for someone, anyone, to blame. And then there was Noah, sitting in a chair near the end of the table, silent but watchful, his presence alone enough to draw sneers from those who still saw him as Dalton's charity experiment. One of the executives slammed a fist against the table. "We're bleeding credibility. If we don't announce a recovery plan in 24 hours, the markets will tear us apart." Another, thinner and sharper in both voice and frame, sneered in Noah's direction. "Perhaps our CEO should stop wasting time on pet projects and start focusing on salvaging what's left. Bringing in outsiders with no experience. It's laughable. And now look where we are." Noah felt the weight of the room tilt against him, but he didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, not on his accuser, but on Alexandra. She sat at the head of the table, her posture as flawless as ever, But Noah could see it, the faint tension in her shoulders, the way her hand gripped her pen just a fraction too tightly. For all her composure, she was carrying the crushing weight of expectation, of empire, of legacy. And for the first time since he had met her, Noah saw not just a CEO, but a human being cornered by a system designed to devour its own. He spoke then, his voice low but cutting through the chaos like the sharp edge of a blade. "You don't have 24 hours," he said evenly. "You have 12. The room fell silent, eyes snapping toward him with incredulity, outrage, even faint amusement. "And what exactly," one of the men spat, "makes you the authority to decide that?" Noah leaned forward, his tone steady, factual, relentless. "Because the leak isn't just financial, it's operational. Someone inside has been feeding data to your competitors for weeks. The patterns are all over your production reports if you bother to look. And if I could spot it from the scraps you left lying around, so have others. By sunrise, they'll weaponize it." The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Alexandra's eyes narrowed, sharp and intent, not in disbelief, but in recognition. She had seen him studying, had dismissed it as diligence. Now she realized it had been vigilance. "Do you have proof?" she asked, her voice cutting through the murmurs. Noah nodded slowly. "Not yet, but I can get it. Give me access to the restricted reports in half a night. If I'm wrong, you've wasted a few hours. If I'm right, it'll buy you the leverage you need to turn this around." A murmur spread through the room, executives exchanging skeptical glances. Some scoffed openly. But Alexandra didn't look away from him. She studied him with the same sharpness she had shown in her office weeks ago, when she had offered him a test. Only now the stakes were no longer personal. They were corporate survival. Finally, she turned to her staff. "Do it," she ordered. "Grant him clearance." The protests erupted instantly. "This is madness. You can't entrust confidential files to a stranger. It's irresponsible." Her voice cut through them like a whip. "I said do it!" Silence followed, thick and reluctant. Orders were carried out. Within minutes, Noah had access to systems far beyond what most employees ever saw. He worked in silence, hunched over data streams and files, his fingers moving with deliberate precision. Hours blurred as night swallowed the city, the boardroom now lit only by the pale glow of screens and the dim silver wash of moonlight through the glass walls. By dawn, he had what he needed. Patterns of discrepancies that mapped not to error but to intent. Memos altered subtly, shipments redirected, resources drained in ways designed to cripple Dalton Tech while boosting its rival across the river. And the trail pointed not to some faceless outsider but to one of their own executives, a man seated in that very room the night before, his voice loudest in casting blame. When Noah presented the findings, the boardroom erupted again, but this time with shock, fury, and the frantic shuffle of damage control. Security was called. The guilty man sputtered denials until evidence silenced him. And through it all, Noah stood quietly, his presence no longer laughable, no longer ignorable. Alexandra Dalton watched him with something new in her gaze, something sharp but softened by respect, perhaps even admiration. He had done what her legion of polished advisors had failed to do. He had cut through the noise, seen the truth, and saved her company from a collapse that would have tarnished her name forever. Later that morning, when the crisis had been contained and the building had begun to exhale its first cautious sigh of relief, Alexandra found Noah alone on the balcony outside her office. The city stretched beneath them, golden with the new sun, the storm of the night before finally gone. She stepped beside him, her presence quiet but commanding. "You've changed everything," she said softly, her voice carrying less steel than he had ever heard. Noah shook his head. "No, I just did what needed doing." She turned toward him then, her eyes searching his face with a frankness that startled him. "That's the difference, isn't it? You don't do things for gain. You do them because they're right. That's what this place has lost. That's what I almost forgot." For a moment, neither spoke. The wind tugged gently at her hair. The city hummed. far below, and the silence between them was not awkward but weighted with meaning. Finally, she drew a breath. Dalton Tech doesn't need another executive with a silver spoon. It needs someone like you, someone who knows what it means to fight for survival, who knows what integrity looks like when it costs something. I want you here, Noah, not as an experiment, not as a charity, as a man who has earned it. He looked at her then, the weight of months of struggle pressing hard against the rising tide of possibility. "And what about my son?" he asked quietly, the question carrying more than curiosity. It carried hope, fear, love. Her expression softened in a way he had never seen before. "He deserves a father who doesn't have to choose between doing right and surviving. Let me make sure of that." The morning sun caught her words and carried them into the silence that followed. And for the first time in a long time, Noah Evans allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the storm that had stolen his chance had also brought him exactly where he was meant to be.